Before we begin this journey, I'm going to ask you to imagine three things.
I pray the Lord to my soul.
I want you to think of the worst population decimation in the last 200 years.
If I die.
Think of someone whose daily decisions cost thousands of lives.
They will hand over the terrorists.
Now, think of peaceful resistance movements that led to successful revolutions.
We are fighting a principle, fighting white domination.
Now I pray the Lord.
I'm guessing Samoa didn't feature in any of those thoughts. This is the story of the deadly decision that brought death to paradise and sowed the seeds of revolution that led to independence, all in the small South Pacific island of Samoa. 1918 is a theatre show that is a response to the Spanish Influenza of 1918 that devastated 25% to a third of the Samoan population at the time. '18 was inspired by the memories of my grandmother, Apia Harbour. She was 4 years old when the Spanish influenza hit Samoa. So I remember her telling us the story about a young woman who had died of the influenza while breastfeeding her baby. And then about remembering when the mass graves were being dug. Once I got older and I was in my career of being an artist and did some postgraduate study, it just brought back all the things that my nana had told us. You know, that kind of inspired me to go and make a theatre work about it, because I thought that would be the best way to get the information out to our communities who had never heard of it.
Influenza killed, most estimates say about 50 million. There's some pretty good research out there suggesting as high as 100 million in the space of roughly a year to 18 months. And if that's true, then that's 5% of the global population dying in that period, which to the best of our knowledge is the single greatest human mortality event in that time span ever. In late 1917, the best evidence shows that a variant form of influenza went with American troops into Europe. This wave was like a lot of the other influenzas we see, where it strikes a lot of people get sick, but not many people die. However, at some point in 1918, this changed. And what you have is a virus that is not very lethal, converting into a virus that is extraordinarily lethal. And this particular virus exploded out of Western Europe in mid-June, went into Britain, across into the United States, and from there started spreading around the world.
You know, it was the end of what they called the Great War, because they thought this was going to be the last war ever. So you've got all these soldiers returning home, you know, hugging and kissing their families, and you've got all these families and cities and townsfolk and whole countries of people getting reunited, which of course is like the perfect conditions for a flu bug to spread.
The more significant second wave reached New Zealand in October 1918. By late October 1918, Auckland was definitely infected with the second wave, more virulent version of influenza. The Talune left Auckland in late October for its standard run around the Pacific, leaving a harbor that was definitely infected. They had to leave 2 crewmen behind because they were too sick to get on the ship. They loaded soldiers that were already showing signs of illness, and they knew that they were leaving a port that was infected with infected people on board. Yet the port gave them a clean bill of health, and the captain of the vessel signed it.
When everyone talks about being a proud Samoan and the freedom and independence of being a Samoan, it's also understanding what we had to go through to get to that, especially for us that are born and raised in Aotearoa. Understanding that the relationship between Samoa and New Zealand is very complex.
It's well documented that around the end of the 19th century, Samoa was being fought over by all these various colonial powers, the Americans, the British, the Germans.
Well, New Zealand's interest in Samoa dates back to the 1870s, and New Zealand always had its eye on Samoa as one of the colonial territories of their Pacific Empire. At the outset of the First World War, New Zealand expeditionary forces landed in Apia and seized or captured Samoa from the Germans.
Samoa was like the jewel, I think, for them. So they pretty much begged the British to be able to come over here and capture some German mast.
There was a feeling for the Germans that is reflected, because, they did a lot of good things. And it's reflected in that old song the oldies used to sing. Talo fasia mani, leona masanye, olomotuole ave, eli peletani. So, there was a feeling, of fellowship.
When you compare New Zealand early administration to the Germans, they actually took time to learn about the culture. So a new force coming in would have brought some new suspicions. Samoa was under a military administration from 1914 to 1919. And so Colonel Robert Logan was the administrator. The military men were ordinary New Zealanders, and many of them, it was the first time in Samoa. They had no prior knowledge of Samoa or the language and the culture. So I think the lost in translation did happen quite quickly, and I think the influenza would have exacerbated some of those tensions.
Yeah, when I look at the water, I just look at her and I just feel like, man, you've been through some shit, man. Because it's our highway. It's the way we were connected and disconnected from the world. It is the natural place of where we expect these great things that come in from the ocean.
The Talune would travel depending on its requirements. Its normal route was to stop in Fiji, pick up staff, go from there to Samoa and Tonga, pick up, it was generally fruit. And if there was a reason to go to American Samoa, then they'd go to American Samoa. But that trip, it wasn't scheduled to go there.
This is where it happened. We're sitting here in Apia Harbour. I'm just really thinking about how excited our people would have been to greet the boat for many different reasons. Not knowing that it was actually carrying a deadly disease.
So the Talune arrived on the 7th of November, 1918, and actually was not quarantined.
And even when the ship first came into the harbor, there was a voice in Samoan that cried very loudly, multiple people have reported this, there is disease on this ship. Logan was really loath to act without direct instructions from Wellington, and he had received none.
You know, this guy was wasn't he a mayor in Otago town? And then I don't know how they decide that he's the man qualified to lead this mission to Samoa.
When he was asked why no quarantine was put in place in Apia, Logan reported that there were no facilities for it. However, there is a minister on record stating that he had offered the meeting hall, which would hold up to 50 people in Apia. Logan turned him down.
He panicked. And I've done a fair bit of research into it because, you know, my people on both sides suffered very much, you know, from the epidemic. And in the end, I concluded that in this situation, people were quite lost.
It's shocking. There should almost be a levy. Every tourist that comes in should pay a levy, a ship of death levy. Just like 20 tala that you add to their airfare.
You know, the quarantine wasn't done, so in terms of, like, you know, it's, you know, yeah, it's like, say,
People were allowed to come on, people were allowed to go off, Samoan laborers were allowed to come on and help unload, and people started dying. I believe the next day was the first death, and then deaths just started occurring one after another. It took less than a week before the disease was widespread.
Everybody's sick, died or dying or something.
It was a crisis. They were unprepared for it.
It is worth noting that American Samoa, which managed to utterly escape the influenza, the only place on the planet that did, offered a full medical team because none of their staff were ill, and all of their doctors and nurses, all the U.S. Navy, volunteered to come over, and Logan refused them.
The general feeling of people was, how could you do this to us?
The illness was so rapid that people weren't even sure what exactly was happening.
Normally, influenza strikes the very young and the very old. Nearly all deaths are in children under the age of 1 or in elderly individuals. In this case, nearly every single death occurred between the ages of roughly 18 and 45. And it tended to be the healthiest people, or at least the ones that seemed the most robust, all over the world, and that was not an exception in Samoa.
It killed about a quarter of our population. And there were no people to bury the dead, so that in fact it festered and made it worse, you know, for people. That is the bodies.
So this is my nana, Apia Harbour. If it wasn't for my nana, I wouldn't have made that show. I wouldn't be here going on this whole journey of discovery.
You know what Samoans are with death too, right? I mean, we, you know, over here, it's one of the things I love about over here. You know, my grandmother's buried in front of her house. That's how close we feel to our dead. You know, they might have died, but they're not forgotten. And they're never that far, especially when they're right outside the backyard. So you look at that, and you look at how we think about death and our people that die. And then you look at what happened with the influenza, the fact that no one could even have a funeral. You know, things were so bad that basically all you could do was carry your deceased relative to the edge of the road where they would be collected. You can imagine how that would have felt to those people. that they couldn't honour them in that way.
When you have mass burials, the protocol of going through the ritual of death, where you have a si'i, where you have the acknowledgement of past and current relationships. So when those protocols are in effect lost themselves, the grieving process almost feels unfinished.
The fact that we were forced to have mass graves. Samoa doesn't do mass graves. We shouldn't be, you know, that's not how we treat our people who die. We don't just dig a big hole and chuck them in.
As thankful as I am that we found this place, because this is the only marked mass grave that everyone refers to. It's a really somber feeling to think of the bodies that are laying here, because I'm thinking about, children, adults, families.
Nothing like this had happened before. And on the face of it, it seemed that, you know, it was like a curse brought over. And this is how they understood it.
I don't think the community at that time were able to articulate in a way that could express some of that grief.
It's the sort of story that, if isn't told, it almost could pass into the realms of myth, because no one actually would believe that could have happened. But it did happen. And there are families today that are bearing the scars of that. And there is a country of people today that are missing a real big chunk.
We do have stories of, Ta'isi Olaf Nelson, whose son was affected by the influenza and sadly died at the age of 4. And that story transcends to the clock tower because he offered the clock and the chimes to remember his son. So that clock tower, represents a really important time because at that point, there was nothing to remember those who had died.
We had 40,000 people live here. That was our total population. And then just like that, 8,000 are wiped out in less than a month.
Somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000, which made up somewhere between 22 and 26, 27% of the population.
So when we think about the Spanish influenza, it's easy for us to just think about numbers and statistics and population and, and it seems so far away, but these are actual human stories. These are actually families that we're connected to.
O le tamā o lo tamā ma le tinā o lo tamā. na maliliu mai le whaamai nea. E maliliu o mātutua, a le taimile nā masalo po le iwa le sefulu tausanga o luk tama. Sa waile uso matua o luk tama e whaifi au le nu o wā vai whale ali. Sa wailo ave i whale ali ni luk tama. Na maliliu mātua o la iti.
Yeah.
O la iti. Ae na matua la ngona le whanau mantua fwoi o. Whanau e whanau tele o la tō. O lo tama ma leisi tau le a sa la tō. Lesi tama. Le sa la tau siel to ina ma lo matua. Ya peita e la wa maali liu fatas. Wa o lo matua la ngona o le whanau no. O lo e leo mwhai ona nā tia i la ngona le a inga taitas. I whanau. Ai mese wa pēr no whake mā fudi ai la tōna maali liu. I le au mātutua.
What had happened with the Spanish influenza and the lack of care from the New Zealand administration was one of the driving forces or the catalyst towards self-determination and independence. Samoa mo Samoa.
If you kind of look beyond what happened in isolation and look at what sprung from that, you know, the fact that the Mau were around already, but that this event seemed to galvanise the organisation more and led to that real political awareness of, hey, come on.
Yes, the influenza contributed to the Mau movement.
It was a movement for self-government. You know, Mahatma Gandhi is well known for his non-violent stance. So Samoa could lay claim to a non-violent movement.
So we're here at the original location of the headquarters of the Mau movement in Veimoso. The original base is still here, but they've had to rebuild the little whale on top.
So by 1926, there was a lot of dissatisfaction among the local community, and thinking about the influenza and the alarm that New Zealand would take over after the crisis really brought a lot of concern to people. And so the Mau emerged from various perspectives. It was a combination of community groups coming together. But as we see later on, it then becomes Samoa mo Samoa. It becomes an indigenous movement. There's agency there, and also becomes quite organised.
The New Zealand administration at the time were not very happy.
You know, I mean, we are fierce people. We do have a warrior background. But it's interesting that at that time, when we had to overthrow or have freedom, that the tools that were chosen was non-violent resistance.
So there is that iconic photograph of the Mau movement that was actually taken here.
That photo, you know, it's such a moving image because Tupua is seated in the front row wearing white, surrounded by the Mau supporters. And it's a real statement that, you know, this is the government, this is where we're choosing to have the site of our government, this is the uniform. So it's a really compelling image because it's really making that statement that this really is Samoa mo Samoa.
When I think of that photo, I think of how proud they were, how regal they looked. You know, these iconic, strong leaders of the nation, you know, moving this revolutionary movement. And I wonder if they knew the terror that was about to unfold.
Yeah, so they were marching down Beach Road. And so that march was a march for solidarity. Sadly, there was some confusion in terms of pushing and shoving and some words being exchanged. Shots rang out.
The shots came from up there.
And Tupua Tamasisile Alofi was shot, as were other Matai, about 10. And they were shot by New Zealand police. So there's a real sense of there was some commitment on the part of the government, and the fact that they had firearms out at a peaceful protest, it raises a lot of questions.
This amazing man, you know, before Gandhi, before Martin Luther King, this guy was preaching non-violent resistance. Samoans were doing non-violent resistance. It's very actually of now.
While he was down, Tupua, as we know, had some farewell words and some words to really encourage the country to maintain peace at all costs. And I think that was really at the heart of who he was as well.
There was a feeling these people do not have love for us. They mean us harm.
There would have been a lot of anger, blame, and, you know, the history also tells us, you know, how the administration responded.
The Mau were pretty much hunted. They would arrest up to 400 people and place them in prison. So it was real chaos.
That's the thing. See, there was no outcry in New Zealand about what happened. Therefore, it seemed like the New Zealand administration was able to carry on and do whatever.
1935, the Labour government comes to power for the first time in New Zealand. And the Labour Party had been really supportive of the Mau. And they actually validate the Mau. And so the Mau begins to take positions in government.
Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the ship hadn't come in. What would have been the path towards independence? I know we were always going to get there eventually.
Independence takes a few decades.
And of course, you know, the whole question about, especially for smaller countries, is it viable, you know, to be a standalone country? And, you know, that was always, I think, a very big question.
Although it's funny, you know, I mean, independent for 3,000 years and then some Balagis come in and tell you, oh, no, you're not. And then you have to somehow apply to the Balagi rules to say, oh, no, we are now, according to your definition.
Well, I was born in 1957. My father, he was the first Prime Minister when we became independent.
Well, independence finally comes in 1962.
I remember the independence because the New Zealand Prime Minister at the time, Holyoake, he stayed with us, and I got kicked out of my room so they could stay in my room.
acknowledge with regret the decision taken by the New Zealand authorities in 1918 to allow the ship Talune carrying passengers with influenza to dock in this harbour at Apia. There were also the shootings in this town, Apia, in December 1929 of non-violent protesters by New Zealand police. On behalf of the New Zealand government, I wish to offer today a formal apology to the people of Samoa for the injustices. We are truly sorry for what happened all those years ago.
I think that they were genuinely wanting to set to rest any lingering elements of whatever between our two countries.
As lovely as that apology was, I think it would have had more meaning for Samoans if it had come with, I don't know, money, compensation. Maybe they could have reopened that loophole that would have allowed every Samoan who lived in Samoa during the time of New Zealand's administration to actually be citizens, which was the case before the Muldoon government, you know, shut that up.
1918 is very important. It illustrates the resilience of our people, but also acknowledges the effects of colonialism in the Pacific.
The attitudes that contributed to that colonialist rule are still around today. You just have to look at Facebook and you see comments about Pacific people. So I don't know, it's not us that has to learn the story. It's actually New Zealanders.
I think it's a Samoan thing, but I think also a human thing. Time has gone. Hopefully, you know, things have healed and you move on.
Moving forward, it's really important for us to be aware of what we've gone through, especially at this time in the forever changing landscape in Samoa, bringing back this message for us to not forget how these outside forces influence the way, not only that the world sees us, but the way that we view ourselves. And that is most important, and just to not forget about that.